statewide on companies that have the potential and aspiration to scale. Within that focus, we try to be what we call industry agnostic and stage agnostic, because we know that Tennessee startups can come from a wide variety of industries, and we also want to support these startups from their idea stage all the way through to their growth stage. We're really putting a heavy focus on diversity in terms of gender, race, ethnicity, veteran status, all those sorts of things. And we really believe that an entrepreneur can look like anyone and be from anywhere and do nearly anything. So with that in mind, we orient our support into 5 different focus areas that you see here, and I'll just go over them really briefly. So capital, we're talking about both debt and equity sources that we can connect early stage companies to. Market access, by that we mean contact with the customer, so whether that's for feedback or strategic partnerships or even for revenue opportunities. Commercialization, which we'll come back to in more detail in just a moment. Environment, which is referring to a favorable legislative environment, as well as connectivity among different entrepreneur service organizations across the state. And then talent, and so what we mean by talent is that Tennesseans should have the skills they need to start or work with early stage companies, and then likewise those early stage companies can find the talent and human resources that they need here in Tennessee. So we want to be sure that entrepreneurs have access to resources in all of these focus areas when and where they need those. And in order to do that, we need a strong partnership network. And so this map you see here kind of represents that statewide network, and that network is how an entrepreneur here in Nashville could connect to, say, a mentor in Knoxville or an investor in Memphis. The idea is that the entrepreneurial researcher here in Nashville should and can and should be able to leverage the resources across the entire state, and we have a competitive advantage when we do that. These are our kind of formal partners. We also count maybe 30-something partners when you consider the colleges and universities that we work with, the entrepreneurial service organizations that aren't listed here, and then other organizations in both the public and the private sectors. And then, of course, right here in your backyard, you've got several partner organizations that we work with that support the entrepreneurial ecosystem in Nashville and in Middle Tennessee. Of course, we've got Vanderbilt Center for Tech Transfer and Commercialization, which we're grateful to them for hosting this workshop here. The National Entrepreneur Center, which is located downtown, working with people that have an idea that's on the back of a paper napkin all the way through, again, to that growth stage. Cumberland Emerging Technologies, if you're looking for space and are in the life sciences, they could be a great resource. And then also Pathway Lending and Pathway Women's Business Center located here as well. Nashville's lucky in that there are a lot of diverse and plentiful resources, more than what's listed on here. But if you aren't connected to any of these, and you should be and want to be, just make sure you let me know, and we'd be happy to plug you in to that local community here. Okay, so going back to commercialization, I do want to kind of highlight some of the resources from this focus area. I'll first call out our mentor network. So this is essentially a milestone-driven as opposed to being a calendar-driven type accelerator program, and it connects startups with mentors and industry networks to prepare for funding events. We're currently operating those in life sciences and energy, but we'll be expanding to at least 2 additional industries at some point this year, so stay tuned for that, it's really exciting. Also, microgrants are a really important and kind of in high demand resource that we're offering. That program pays for grant writing support from vetted consultants, up to $4,000 for phase 1 and up to $6,000 for phase 2 or fast track. And the idea behind that is really amplifying the application that you're able to submit so that it has the highest likelihood of success of funding. LaunchTN also administers the SBIR STTR matching fund for Tennessee, and we're actually in the process of finalizing the budget for that for fiscal year 20. Although it's looking good that it'll be funded at a greater dollar amount than last year, which is really exciting. For fiscal year 19, that fund was allocated $1.5 million. The program guidelines for this coming year are still being finalized, but it should be similar to last year, which was a 50% match. For phase 1, 60% if you were from a tier 3 or 4 county, women-owned, minority-owned, veteran-owned or owned by someone with a disability, and then take a 25% match for phase 2. So it'll probably be very, very similar to that. The angel tax credit is a credit up to $50K per investor, currently applied to the Hall income tax, and so it'll be that way for at least the next couple years. But companies can qualify if they're commercializing technology from a Tennessee Research Institute or have won an SBIR, STTR award. And the impact fund, that's currently a $1.7 million effort to invest in for-profit startups that have can demonstrate some kind of social, economic, community impact for our state. And that's typically a 25% match of private capital of $50 to $150K. Yeah.
How many people have utilized the SBIR, STTR microgrant support?
The microgrants, yeah, that's been in pretty high demand. I will say since I started Launch Tennessee in January, we've probably approved 10.
Yeah, sounds about right.
Does that seem accurate? And that, I would say that's more than we had in the past, but there seems to be more increased.
And do you have any feedback from those who you supported? So how much better off they were getting the support versus where they were before?
Yes, so we do send out a survey after completing just to kind of get feedback on the grant writers. And we do have a long list of kind of vetted grant writers to know that they have that experience in SBIR. And so we would kind of ask questions related to, was it helpful to work with someone else? The good thing is that the company's not fitting the bill for that, and so it's covered by Launch Tennessee through that. Jim can probably speak more to what it's like on the grant writer side because he is one of those vetted consultants. We also track wins, so how many of those go on to win SBIR, and Jim will talk about how low that percentage is overall, and the winning percentage is higher for those who utilize the microgrants than the overall group. So that's a benefit.
And the support on that is more technical side, or it's more making sure that everything is in order and those.
It's more the latter. I mean, if the consultant has to end up writing your grant, your chances of winning are pretty low. But we have seen that before. But usually it's strategy. Obviously, if you get someone who's technically minded, to help you, they can advise you, try to make sense of what you're trying to say, tell the story. But we'll talk more about that.
Yeah, and I'll just add, as far as timeline, when our review committee is looking at that, they are typically approving those that are at least 30 days out, and so that there is time for that kind of back and forth and feedback. Honestly, 60 days or more is probably preferable, but if someone's contacting us and the deadline's in a week, we'll look at it as case-by-case basis, but depending on how much work they've done on the front end, that's less likely to be approved, rather than if they have more time to kind of work with the grant writer.
What's the review process look like for this?
For the applications?
Yeah.
So
Fast.
it is fast. Usually we'll get back in a couple of days. There's an online application, and we'll link to that when we give you these slides.
And one of the requirements is you need to either take this workshop or have some sort of SBIR training. So if you're interested in that, you're already checking the box.
Yep, so that's one requirement, and then also a referral, so that it's not like a self-referral, but if the Center for Tech Transfer can refer you, or one of the entrepreneur centers, or there's a long list of what's acceptable for that.
Is it check boxes, or is it highly competitive?
So I wouldn't say that's competitive as if it's you or someone else is going to get it, but pending funding availability, there is a kind of quality baseline at which the application gets scored and needs to be higher than a certain score to get it. I'm sorry.
Who scores it? That's really what I was trying to figure out.
Oh, people from Launch Tennessee. So there's a review committee of 3 people.
3 people?
Yeah, and they each score independently.
I see.
Yeah, and one of the main things that we're looking at for that is preparedness. And so, to Jim's point, if someone hasn't engaged with SBIR, hasn't taken a workshop, or doesn't really know what they're getting into, that's less likely to be approved than someone who's kind of done the groundwork.
And it's not a one or done deal. If you apply and there's more work to be done, then they'll give you advice on people. I've seen people reapply.
Oh yeah, and get it the second time for
Can
sure.
you give a couple of examples of who were funded through the Impact Fund?
I'm sorry?
Can you give a couple of examples of who were funded through the Impact Fund?
Yes, so I won't name them just because I don't know exactly what's going on there, but impact is very broadly defined, and so one of them is like a health company that's bringing new technology to improve health domestically, but then also abroad. And so that's like a little maybe more traditionally like an impact kind of definition. Creating more jobs for Tennessee can also be considered impact. So it's really a pretty broad definition as far as what would qualify. There's also information about how to apply online, and then there's like a due diligence process for that. Yeah. Oh, and then one other thing that I want to mention that's not on this slide is this coming year we'll be kind of piloting and then hopefully kind of adjusting and implementing more fervently this idea called lab share, which is the idea is we have a network set of facilities and equipment that are available or accessible to Tennessee startups. And so through a customer discovery process, we've identified some barriers to that. So financial is one of them, other forms of access. And so we'll be working to, one, just kind of take an inventory of what space and what facilities are available to startups, and then secondarily we'll be trying to see what Launch Tennessee can do to increase access to that. So if you have any thoughts about that, or ideas or people you think I should connect with, definitely feel free to let me know. We're still very much in the early stages of that, so just something.
A question.
Yes.
A question on the SBIR, STTR matching fund.
Yes.
So at what point do you apply for that? Is it after you get word that,
Yeah, so you have to have a notice of award in order to apply for the match.
and what's the percentage match?
It's 50% for, well, currently. The next fiscal year may be different, but this current year that we're in, it was a 50% match on phase one up to $150,000. 25% match on phase two, same cap, and then it was a 60% match instead of 50 for those groups that I named. Yeah. Okay, and then I just wanted to highlight, I won't spend a lot of time on this slide, but these are some of the companies that Launch Tennessee is or has worked with. And I like this slide because I think that it just really highlights why commercialization is important and why we focus on it. These companies are doing really amazing things. One of them is developing a low-cost manufacturing technique of high-value carbon nanotubes. They're only using like a couple of ingredients to do that, which is really cool. Another is revolutionizing wound care and healing by using Manuka honey. Yet another is designing a way to break the transmission cycle of Lyme disease. And so there's really revolutionary stuff happening in Tennessee, and we want to do what we can to kind of help bring those things to market and make them accessible. So so that is kind of why we do this. This workshop is part of that kind of commercialization effort, and so our hope is that through the workshop today, you will, one, gain familiarity with the SBIR, STTR if you don't have it already. If you do, and you think this could be a good step for your business, hopefully identifying kind of where in the timeline and the path that makes the most sense, and then if and when you are ready to apply, some kind of helpful strategies and hints on how to make that application the most successful it can be, and Jim will talk throughout it about some different resources that you can access to help you do that.
So really appreciate you all being here today. I always love coming to Vanderbilt. So I'm a Vanderbilt alum. I got my PhD here back in 2000. We've had some pretty good success with some Vandy folks, spinning off companies, and I know that I'd like to see more and more of it happen. It doesn't seem like it happens fast enough, but there is a process to this, and this is just one piece of the puzzle. And I'll stress some points here about the value of doing the SBIR beyond getting an SBIR. Obviously the goal is to win the award, get the money, start your business, have an opportunity to do this. So polling the room here, how many folks here are Vanderbilt faculty or staff affiliated with the university? Pretty much everybody except that guy, I know he's But, and how many people has anybody applied for SBIR before? Has anybody won SBIR before? Okay, great. Well, you guys can come up here and teach this. So that's great, and we'll certainly, if you have any advice or anything to add, I'd appreciate hearing that. So a little bit about my background, as I mentioned, I I got my PhD here in biomedical engineering in 2000, and in 2004 I spun off Pathfinder, which is from the Department of Biomedical Engineering, Bob Galloway, who's now retired. And but he was my PhD advisor, and I was working as a research faculty. I should really write a book on this, everybody tells me, because it was a pretty crazy ride. But I was halfway through business school at Belmont when Vanderbilt had a fund at that point, Discovery Life Sciences Fund, where they spun off Pathfinder. We were very lucky to win 2 fast track SBIR awards. And that really carried the company through this valley of death that we'll talk about. And we raised a lot of money, and eventually we sold the technology, although I wouldn't say anybody like retired to an island in France or off the coast in the Mediterranean or anything. Investors lost quite a bit of money, which is pretty usual and pretty normal for a lot of high-risk startups. But I'm proud that the technology got developed and started as an idea out of Bob's lab with me and a few other folks. So right now I'm back in the startup thing, trying to make a go of it. I worked for LaunchTN for a couple years, and then went back and started Raven Healthcare. So we're an artificial intelligence machine learning company. I actually licensed the technology from Indiana University and Centerstone, which, if you're familiar with Centerstone, they're one of the largest providers of community-based mental health. SBIR has been an important part of both winning and losing. SBIRs have been an important part. Winning, obviously, at Pathfinder was a big part. I've lost a couple SBIR. I've won at Raven, but we've actually taken advantage of that material to get where we are today as a company. And I'll explain the value of just taking the time to write one of these grants. Obviously, you want to win, but there's a lot of value in just getting the ideas on paper and getting a commercialization plan, and I'll give some ideas around that. So before we get into kind of an outline, this slide's going to show the ways you can try and raise money for your business. You can fund it yourself. You can go to your friends and your family, which afterwards they may not be very friendly. You can find some former friends or some fools to invest in you, which there's always people out there that potentially would do that. Maybe that the chances of them losing their money, so that's why they're former friends. Wouldn't recommend committing fraud. You can get other founders in your company that maybe have deeper pockets that can help fund the business and work with them. Then you can get into some of these other mechanisms by which you can raise venture capital, which is frankly in our state is still very, very difficult to do around a lot of the businesses I think that you guys are thinking of. It's extremely difficult in our state, like I won't lie. But it's better than it was back in 2004 when I started Pathfinder. You can get debt financing through a bank, but most banks, you're not going to go to a bank and say, hey, I need $5 million. I'm not going to be, I may never generate revenue. I may never pay you back, and I can't even sell what I'm doing until I get FDA clearance or approval, and that's going to take 5 years. So can you loan me $5 million? Banks, this isn't what banks do. Banks are a lot less risk averse than you would think. You can get federal tax credits. Unfortunately, a lot of these federal tax credits are for businesses that are already generating revenues. So it's great when you generate revenue and you don't have to pay as much in taxes, but it's not. Most of our businesses, many businesses that go public, and like you've heard about Uber and Lyft, Uber actually buried on page like 400 and something of their prospectus that they may never generate a profit. So that just blows people away on Wall Street, but that's just the nature of a lot of these businesses. And then there's federal funding, which is what we're going to focus on today, and which is something that a lot of you, having written grants, being in the academic space, have a lot of strategic advantages, and certainly here at Vanderbilt have resources outside of LaunchTN and what I'm talking about to help you obtain this funding. So we're going to focus on that. So what are these programs? So if you're not familiar with these, essentially it's set aside money of a certain percentage from both or from all the agencies that exist. Basically, any cabinet level agency has SBIR, STTR funding. The amount of funding is dependent on the size of the agency. So NIH, DoD, those are the biggest ones. They have the biggest pots of money to spend, whereas some of the other agencies have a lot less money to spend. But there's both SBIR and STTR, and we're going to talk about the differences between those. The SBIR program is much bigger. That doesn't mean the success rate is any less. I mean, we've seen some really good Vanderbilt companies get STTRs. Actually, Vanderbilt's done pretty well in STTRs from the ones I've known and worked with. So you shouldn't just dismiss STTR because it's a smaller pot of money. If the project makes sense from an STTR perspective, then it's really good to go after those grants because they are looking for academic partners in those we'll talk about. So you can see this is $2.5 billion a year. When you talk about the entire U.S. budget, the federal budget, it seems like a drop in the bucket, but when you think about venture capital funds and funding that's available, this is like the largest seed fund in the world. So it's a pretty big deal. So what are we going to cover today? We're going to cover the basics of those two programs, the SBIR, STTR. We're going to talk a little bit about the difference between grants and contracts, which is a subtle but important difference in applying for these. Everybody just says, I'm applying for an SBIR grant, but you aren't really applying for a grant if you're trying to get a contract from the government. And then all the fund registration requirements, a lot of stuff that you guys have done, but as a small business, there are things that Vanderbilt does for you or that you don't realize go on in the background that you're responsible for as the small business owner. We'll take a break and then we'll kind of talk, we'll then move more into strategy on these and how to think about writing these grants from your business perspective, from a winning perspective. Obviously, what can you do to have a better chance of winning? Just whatever, like kind of a crash course in that I can show you here over 3 hours. And then we're also going to talk a little bit about timelines and logistics with the state resources, kind of tie into what Allie was talking about. So you can think about, you guys asked some really good questions, how you can piece all these things together. Another thing I should add to the agenda is we are going to cover, for those of you that don't know, the NSF program has changed their SBIR program. They're doing a pilot for the next 6 months. That's really exciting. And so I'm going to cover that. It's essentially a way for you to engage with NSF very quickly and get your pre-application review quickly, and then decide if you want to go for a full application, which they're now rolling admissions. There's no longer or rolling submissions. There's no longer specific drop-dead dates, at least for the next 6 months. So
This is the pitch.
yes, the project pitch. Yeah. So if you've heard about this, great. I'm going to cover that. There's a 1-hour webinar you can watch on that. But for anybody interested in NSF, actually, what I'm telling clients is, even if you're not interested in NSF, because NSF is probably the most broad agency in terms of what they'll accept. You got nothing to lose by just submitting something and getting feedback. Maybe your grant's better for NIH, maybe it's better for DOE, but you got nothing to lose submitting, and if they tell you they like what you're doing and you should submit a full proposal, then you should go after it. So we're going to talk about that. What I want you to leave with here is an understanding of this program, why would it be good for you in the business you either have or you're going to create. I'm trying to give you some tips on how to win, understanding of all the resources you need to get in place, and then a plan to write one of these if you walk out of here. My goal in these, I tell people, is to convince you not to do this. If you walk out of here and you're still interested in this, that's great. But these are really hard. They're a lot of work. I know I'm preaching to the choir. I'm preaching to a lot of academics that have written many R01s and R21s, all the NIH grants, and the success rate is low. So the idea is you want to make sure you're really prepared to do this and you know what you're getting into, and what goals do you have for your business beyond the SBIR, and that's where I'm going to tie in kind of our experience with Raven right now. It's been pretty exciting lately. Okay. So these programs, where did they come from? We already talked about how much money is set aside, but these basically came from from the Bayh-Dole Act back in 1982, when the government determined that, hey, we're putting all this money into non-for-profit, basically academic research. What's the payback for the government? What are we getting in return? And what they decided was we need to spin off more small businesses based on this work. These are, back then venture capital was a very different space, very different time in our country. So they decided this was one way to help create these small businesses that essentially need a lot of capital for some of these ideas. We all know these can be very expensive. So this is one program that you never have to worry about going away. It's shockingly in Washington, this actually has bipartisan support. Always has, always will. It's seen as a very important part of the small business offices, the SBA, and there's really no risk of this ever going away. And they've reauthorized it. They change the rules every now and then, and I'll go through some of the rule changes. And by the way, these slides will be available. I like to update the slides with the latest in material, so I'm usually sometimes doing that the night before. So you'll get a copy of all these slides, so don't worry about having to write all this stuff down. And please interrupt if you have any questions. I see you guys have already done that, so that's great. Okay, so who qualifies for this? So this is not awarded to Vanderbilt. This is not awarded to an academic institution or a non-for-profit. You have to be a for-profit business with 500 or fewer employees, which pretty easy to meet that requirement. Individual ownership, you have to be greater than 50% owned by U.S. individuals or permanent residents. Now, it's been almost 10 years now, they changed the rule. I guess about 8 years ago, they changed the rule to allow venture capital businesses to get this funding. You're put into a special category if you're primarily owned by venture capitalists, you can now get this funding. You're put into a special category, there's not as much money available to you, but the government came to realize that even if you're a venture-backed business and you're owned by venture capital, you can still take advantage of these programs, and these companies need a lot of capital, and the government's trying to help lower the risk to get more venture capital involved. So if you're owned by 50% owned by multiple venture capital companies, you can't be owned by one, you do qualify for SBIR. You have to do all the work in the United States, which is different than other federal grants. Some of those allow work outside the U.S.
You got the work.
What's that?
You mean the work, the lab work you mean?
Everything. All the work has to be done in the United States.
Sales?
No. Sales is different, but any research or work that's done has to be done in the United States. And any work that's done on the grant. No, you can sell it wherever you want. They actually would like you to be worldwide. But the actual grant work has to be done by U.S. companies or consultants or other businesses that are located in the United States. Patent rights. This is a key piece. Obviously, Vanderbilt, unlike a lot of other universities, patents a lot of things, a lot of technologies. The patent rights go to the small firm, or if you have a licensing agreement with Vanderbilt or whoever, we can get into some of the details. But if you create new intellectual property from the grant at your business, you own it. The government has a limited right to use. You have to disclose all this. It's very critical that you disclose it in the right way. But other than disclosing it and the government having a non-commercial use for the technology, then you own it. You can do whatever you want with it. It's yours. You just have to disclose that it was created with federal funding. And when it comes to contracts, we'll talk a little bit more about that as well, because ultimately you want the government as your customer, but the good thing is you still own the technology and can use it elsewhere.
What's the limited right to use mean again?
Sorry?
What is that limited right to use mean again?
Basically, they have a non-commercial right to use the technology. So like, let's say you patent something and your company shuts down or whatever, but the government sees value in the patents you have, they could use it for non-commercial use. Or actually they could use it for non-commercial use anyway, if they wanted to. That's their limited use.
And that's something that rarely happens.
Yes. That's an excellent point,
possible,
Peter.
but it's extremely rare. We've been doing it in our office for decades, and I've only seen it happen once.
Yeah, it's very rare. It's also very rare for you to get in trouble for not disclosing. I mean, you need to disclose that you developed this with government funding, but other than that, the government really doesn't care what you do with it. So, okay, so this gets a little bit now into timelines. These are not for the weak of heart in terms of timelines and patience, because it takes a long time to get these grants. Once you get them, you really need to take advantage of the funding that you get. These phases can happen over years or even decades, depending on how long phase 3 is for whatever device or technology you're getting to market. Generally, phase 1 are proof of concept or feasibility studies. Phase 2, you get more into field testing, potentially clinical investigations if it's a medical technology, safety and efficacy, starting to get maybe down the road of getting sort of FDA clearance or FDA approval. And then basically the government expects that once you're done with phase 2, then the day the money runs out, the venture capitalists are there pouring money into your company, or heaven forbid you're actually selling what you've created, and you go on your merry way and you're successful. This never happens. And because of that, the government created actually this phase 2B program, where if you get a venture cap, and that's really the programs that do that, NIH and NSF, if you can get matching venture capital dollars, they'll give you additional funding to help try and get your technology out into the market. There is a direct to phase 2 program. I've never met anybody that's won one of those. Most businesses, I think, that apply for those are ones that have already won some SBIRs, and they probably have a pretty well-established business. So I wouldn't consider that. I would go, more along the lines of starting with phase 1, or go for a fast track if you think, which is a combination of phase 1, phase 2. But they do allow that. So if you feel like you're beyond phase 1 and you want to go after the bigger dollars in phase 2, you can do that for NIH, DoD, and DOE. Those are the 3. These are competitive, maybe not quite as competitive as your typical federal grants, maybe especially NIH, but pretty close, in terms of success rate. Once you win, though, you should never write a phase 1 without trying to go after a phase 2, because you get the bigger bucks in the phase 2, and obviously the government wants to pick winners. So if you get a phase 1, your chance of getting a phase 2 goes up considerably, 40%, you can see, and that's where you get the bigger dollars. So it's really exciting when you get your first phase 1 or a phase 1 to say, that could really, really move your business forward very quickly. Very quickly in terms of starting, not so quickly in terms of you're going to need more capital, the timing, and all those kind of things. But let's put it this way, the opportunity is there. When you get to phase 1, you've got everything in front of you to be successful, and you've certainly got some street cred behind your technology. So you should definitely go after phase 2. More and more, they are looking at commercial potential. I'd say for a long time this program was essentially, no offense to any, I was an academic too, but a lot of times it's reviewed by academics, and they were not looking at these from a business perspective. I think that's changed a lot over the last 5 to 7 years. They are looking more at the genuine commercial potential, which, of course, that's the purpose of the program. But for a long time, these grants were not thought of in that kind of way. So which is why now more and more customer discovery and some of these other strategies we're going to talk about, you should at least demonstrate somewhere in your grant, even if you only have a paragraph to do it, like in a phase 1 NIH, that you've thought about the customer, you've thought about the usability, all of these factors that go into it, if it's that kind of technology. So we'll talk more about that.
Can you talk a little more about the study sections and who they are comprised?
Sure. I've been on 2 study sections for SBIR. What I've noticed is they're still heavily academic, like even the ones that the grants I've applied for when I look at the reviewers.
Is it typically people who have received funding through this program that are?
No, actually, interestingly, there's a lot of people that are on study sections for this that have never gotten an SBIR, which is kind of drives you crazy.
How are they selected then?
I think it's just based on technical expertise. I mean, whatever, just typical study sections for R01s but they try and have enough business people in there to, to give their perspective. I know when I've been on them, I felt a little intimidated being one of the few business people on the panels. It's still heavily academic, but I do think more and more it seems like the focus is on commercialization and they're thinking about those things.
But I guess so like on an NIH study section, is everybody, they received NIH funding, that's how they got, because typically for like R01 study section, everybody has received NIH funding, they're investigators in the NIH. But for this, it sounds like maybe some business people, are those people, I mean, how are they in the system?
That's a good question. I don't even know. I'm guessing all the academics that are chosen because they've received NIH funding.
Right.
If we just stick with NIH, I don't know if that means they've ever got SBIR. I've met people that have said, oh, I was on a study section for SBIR, so I understand it, but I've never applied or won an SBIR. I'm assuming they've won other federal funding. I don't know about the business people. That's another good point. I mean, I've won, so I've been on 2 study sections, but I don't know. Yeah.
What is the study section?
I think only 10% of the reviewers are from SBIR, people who get SBIR funded. So the rest are academic people.
That have necessarily.
The reason because the criteria of reviewers are the same as R01 application. You still have to go through 5 criteria. So they also focus a lot on novelty. And that is the limitation of SBIR application.
It is.
Because novelty is, if it is too novelty, there's no way we can transfer it to business. But that is the fact how SBIR review manuals look at the application. They do emphasize on the commercialization plan, but not heavily, again, as you mentioned, 90% people are from academic.
Yeah, I've been amazed at how few people have actually applied for SBIR, and you've got them reading commercialization plans. And so on my last commercialization plan that I submitted, to put in perspective, I had one reviewer say, oh, your pricing and your strategy around that is fantastic, A+. The other guy said, this is terrible, this is way too expensive. And I'm like, how do you win? That's the frustrating part of this. You want to pull your hair out because, it's just like any other R01 when you get your feedback back. You're like, man, I got like 1s and 2s from this guy and 5s and 6s and that's it, So it's tough. Yeah.
So I happen to serve on a SBIR, STTR panel for NIH. And like you said, primarily the reason why you end up having a lot of academia people on the panels is because the big part of it is the technical. So they are selected based on their technical expertise.
There you go. Yep.
And in fact, to get on the panels, I mean, the SROs, the subject research officers, contact the different areas, fields and say, who are your top researchers? Send us their names. So Optical Society of America will send, SBIR will send, and then they contact these individuals and recruit them to serve. So they're really, academicians are really there for the technical expertise. And then, what they've been doing is they're trying to add, on those panels, on the one I serve, there's several MDs. So people that are actually clinicians, that would actually utilize the technology.
Mm-hmm. Good point.
Yeah, part of what you just said, I'm curious, but wouldn't surprise me that it may be a situation where somebody that's an MD says, man, this thing's way too expensive, no one would pay that much for it. So that might be part of why, they had this discrepancy in terms of somebody saying, love the commercialization plan, and then somebody who's a clinician and who knows, how much his budget is and what he'd be willing to pay for it, he's going, there's no way I'll use this thing. It's great technology, but it costs too much.
Yep.
So you do have clinicians on the panel. And then they also recruit, and they're heavily now trying to add more people that are from small businesses on the panel. So, I mean, but the mix is still heavyweight towards.
It is, yeah. That's my understanding. That's great. I haven't done them in probably 4 or 5 years was the last time I was on the panel, so.
Are you going to elaborate more on the impact part?
Absolutely, yeah, that's the second part, a lot of that, but, so these are some numbers from NSF, which is really interesting. These are latest numbers that first-time submitters win 68% of the time. It's pretty good. You saw 1 in 12, 1 in 6. So, but if you do this, you do the right grants, you got a good shot at winning. Companies are very young and have very few employees. And that's just typical. There's not 500-person companies. Look, if you have 500 people at a company, or 400, or even 200, you're probably a profitable business. You're not going to waste your time with SBIR. You could probably pay for your research out of retained earnings. I mean, it's a much better way to do this. So these are very small companies that win these. It's very normal for them. So if you're just starting a business, don't be intimidated by the program that you can win or not win. All right, so the SBIR rules. I'm not going to go through all these. You'll get the slide. I think the most important one that everybody needs to understand clearly is that if you get an SBIR, you're the principal investigator, you have to be primarily employed by the small business, period. And primarily employed doesn't mean, well, I work a 60-hour week, so I'm going to work 21 hours at the business and 39 hours at Vanderbilt. You can't do that. It's based on a 40-hour work week. You have to be primarily employed. You basically have to leave your job. And I've talked to the Dean of Engineering, I've talked to some other people about sabbaticals and other opportunities. I don't think that that's been leveraged at Vanderbilt or done at Vanderbilt very often, if at all. So, you got to think very carefully. Are you going to be the PI? I mean, you're going to basically have to quit your job or work out something with your dean or your chair. That's between you and your department. But understand that you have to be primarily employed. You have to basically, you have to get a W-2 from the company that shows you're primarily employed by the company. There's no way around that. People that try and get around that, I've seen them get into trouble, have to pay the money back. So I've heard about that. So that is one of the key factors of SBIR. Now, do you have to be the PI? Can you get a graduate student, a former graduate student? That's what we did at Pathfinder. I was a former grad student. I was the PI. The NIH loves that. I know they see the pedigree there, the technology, who's been working on it. The advisor stays in the academic institution. The students launching the business. Research faculty have an opportunity to do this. Research faculty, there's that they're more on soft money can do that kind of thing. But you have to. That's probably the most critical piece of the SBIR funding.
How is the difference between research faculty and graduate faculty?
Research faculty?
Research faculty.
Well, research faculty, if you're on soft money, then you could possibly change your percent effort as a research faculty. Now, I lost my benefits and other things, right? So the company had to pick those up. But at least I could do that. I had the flexibility to do that as research faculty. If I was tenure track faculty, no, it's almost impossible. Like you'd have to leave your job. So that's, yeah.
What if your PI is a full-time student?
PI is a full-time
Student.
Yeah, they just have to, they're a full-time student, then they have to obviously, they can't move. Most students, like if you're a graduate student or something at Vanderbilt, like I know when I was a grad student, you can't take another job. Your primary job is to be a grad student. So I don't see how you could do that unless you left grad school. Or you could take a leave of absence or something like that.
SBIR would not let that through.
What's that?
SBIR would not let that through.
I'm sorry.
SBIR would not let that through if the PI wasn't.
As long as the day you start the grant and you attest to everything, as long as you're following the rules, they don't care if you were a grad student who's taking a leave of absence, as long as you can attest that I am primarily employed by the business and the business meets all these criteria, you got to sign on the dotted line. As long as you can sign it, it doesn't matter how you get there, they don't care. They don't care. When you apply for the grant, if you say, I'm a full-time student, but I'm gonna leave school to go run this, that's fine. You don't have to make a decision until you're actually awarded the grant and you sign on the dotted line.
So it sounds like if you're not receiving a stipend, if you're like paying for an MBA program, then you can continue with the program.
Yes, sorry. When I think of graduate student, I think of
a scientist whose project is by company.
yeah, if they are a graduate student at Vanderbilt and Vanderbilt's paying their tuition and they're TAing or they're on another research grant or something, they are a full-time student. I'm certain that they cannot be on the, they would have to quit or take a leave of absence from school.
It would be a conflict at both ends. Whoever's paying them, like if you're on an NIH training grant, the NIH would take the money back too.
Exactly. You also can't be funded from two different sources to do essentially the same work. Well, even if it's not the same work, the answer is no, you can't. The student would have to leave. You're right. If you're in a professional program like an MBA student, I don't know, medical student, I guess. I mean, there's no, I don't see how you could be 51% run a business 21 hours a week and go to med school, but I think if you're in a professional program, there's probably ways around that. Especially if you're in a part-time program, like a night school program or something, that doesn't count. If you're paying your own tuition and you're getting an education, that's separate from this, But
Yeah, I can add to that, because, so as a reviewer, there was an application that came through where a professor's graduate student who was working on his PhD dissertation was put as the PI for the proposal. It made it through, but I'll be honest with you, it got killed. And the reason why it got killed was they did not have clear, succinct, language in there that established exactly what was going to happen if it got funded.
there you go. You have to have a
The student
contingency.
was going to leave graduate school, or that
Or graduate.
or that he was graduating at this date and therefore would be available to actually be the PI. So that was an issue.
Yeah, you have to have that in there. And the nice thing is when you get to budget, there are free sections in the grant where you can detail that. One place that I would detail that is budget justification. When you're talking about who are the people on the grant, what are they doing, you can tell a story there. It's free space. You can take as long as you want to tell a story about why this person's experienced, why this person's committed to doing this. Reviewers are going to look at that. But if it's not in there, if it just says, well, right now they say they're a full-time student and they're just what are they going to quit? There's no detail around it.
Yeah, what do you think
It's going to be a red mark. Okay, STTR program. The key role in the STTR program is the PI can have their primary employment with the research institution. So you can keep your day job and be the PI on an STTR. The STTR is still awarded to the small business, but the reason it's called STTR is it's technology transfer. So the idea is there's some technology in a non-for-profit, usually a university, but they say non-for-profit, national lab or whatever, that you're trying to take out. Well, there's a resource there that would be very expensive for the business to utilize, and someone has expertise there that could be the PI. They're going to keep their day job and they're going to work as the principal investigator. The grant is still awarded to the small business. And ideally, there's a person at the small business who's also doing some percentage effort on the grant. But the PI, you can remain at your academic institution. Now, this presents a lot of challenges, as I know Peter can talk about, with conflict of interest. If you're doing work for a small business, and if this is your business you launch, then you own a part of that business. You're doing work, you have graduate students, you're trying to commercialize this, you're keeping your day job, but the work you're doing, you're getting a subcontract from this business to do the work and you own a part of the business, lots of red flags. Not that it can't be done, but it has to be planned. You have to do a lot more planning for these grants on the relationship between the non-for-profit and the business. Now, you may be the PI on the grant and not own any of the business. maybe there's potential for you to own it in the future, but maybe you're working with a small business and you may want to do that someday or something, and you've worked with them to get the grant because you're the PI, and now you're doing this work and there's a chance to commercialize technology that you've had. You could have that, or you could have a small enough ownership that it doesn't raise a lot of red flags. And this is all within the Vanderbilt conflict of interest policy, and which I've actually read very carefully lately because I'm a consultant for the biological sciences on conflict of interest here at Vanderbilt. So it's very attractive, and actually there's a lot of technologies at very large academic institutions like a Vanderbilt that you can tell a really good story about why you need an STTR, because there's a technology there that is expensive. There's no way a small business could afford all of this, and the process of then transferring it to the company, you got to tell a good story about that. Because ultimately the company's got to commercialize whatever this is. It can't just live at the university forever. But just to be clear, this is still awarded to the small business. So there has to be someone on the small business side that's managing this process. And I've seen a lot of faculty members start companies, get STTRs, and then deal with this conflict. It's not trivial. There can be definitely be some challenges. You can see the other rules on there. The one key on STTR is, for NSF, the PI still has to be employed by the small business. So you cannot get an NSF STTR and have the principal investigator be employed by the company. You can see I've got DOD, NIH, DOE, and NASA allow the PI, but not NSF. That's a key factor.
Can you get around a lot of these by co-PI type of thing?
So, yes and no. Like co-PI, I know you have to be very careful with the definition of co-PI, because then that can lead to who has different authorities. I usually like to use the word co-investigator. Here's another key factor you can think about when you're trying to work all this out. The only employee that has to be primarily employed by the small business is the PI. So there's no reason why you can't be a co-investigator, be on the company's budget. And if it's like, hey, it's summer support, you can be a co-I, and that's your summer support. There's nothing stopping you from doing that, because you don't have to be primarily employed by the company. The only person that has to be primarily employed by the company is the PI on an SBIR.
When you're talking about the co-PI, that would be more like the subcontractor, wouldn't it?
Yeah, and I would be careful even using the word co-PI. I just call them co-investigator on a subcontract.
Right.
Yeah, you could have a subcontract with Vanderbilt for sure. Like the company, you see that I haven't gone over the percentages, but basically on an SBIR, 1/3 of the money in a phase one can go to the small business or to the consultant. And on a STTR, you can see up to 60% can go to the research institution. Minimum of 30% has to go. So yeah, there are ways that you can get paid through Vanderbilt, but I also think there are ways, since you're not primarily employed by the company, you could be on the company's budget as a co-investigator, as long as you work it out with Vanderbilt. You're like, I'm keeping my day job, but this is my summer support, or this is some percent effort over the year, but I'm not the PI. I'm a co-I, a co-investigator. So, yeah.
So what do you mean by employed and paid? So if the company gives the money to the institution, and the institution allocates to pay the person's tuition and their
That's a subcontract. You would get a W-2, you have to get a W-2 from the company. It cannot come through a subcontract. You have to be primarily employed by the company. It cannot go through a subcontract. If it goes through a subcontract, then you're not employed by the company. You're being employed. The company's paying Vanderbilt to pay you.
Can you subcontract back to your own lab, or is that a constant? Like if you're going to be
You can, but I guarantee you the Vanderbilt lawyers are going to be all over that.
Yeah.
Right? If you get awarded an SBIR, and this would happen at Pathfinder. We were awarded an SBIR. I'm a former grad student. I basically quit my job at Vanderbilt. We went to go work for the small business, so I'm the PI, no issues there. But then we had a pretty large subcontract back to Vanderbilt, back to the labs, that every lab we had a subcontract with had ownership in Pathfinder. Well, everybody had to stop, we had to sit down, we had to decide who, I mean, the question there is, okay, if it's in your lab, obviously, and you got new grad students working on this, they're interested in commercialization, but you're incentivized, there's potential money for you, financial reward.
Was that manageable though? You were able to manage it?
Yes, we were able to manage it. We had to have yearly reviews, and there were a couple tricky times there where I remember one time, so we ended up hiring, I should say I, not we, because I was running the business. I ended up hiring a graduate student who was a friend of mine who was brilliant. When he graduated, he left Vanderbilt. He had a technology that we ended up licensing to the company. It was another patent that we brought into the company. We had a straightforward process at that time with Vanderbilt. It took about 6 years. It took us about 6 years to figure all that out, but we finally figured it out right when the company started to fail. We finally figured out how to do tech transfer. But anyway, we brought in that. But then we're sitting there one day and we came up with a totally new invention. Like three of us who were at the company, full-time at the company. And we thought, this is awesome. We need to talk to Bob and these other, nope. We immediately used our formal disclosure form and we disclosed the invention, that we invented it. And then we thought very carefully, how are we going to approach the Vanderbilt guys? Are they going to come over here and put on their Pathfinder hats? Or are they going to be wearing their Vanderbilt hats? Can they ever take off their Vanderbilt hats? So that was an issue there. So we ended up really not sharing that idea with the co-founders until we had it kind of fleshed out and it was clear. Because at that point, our investors were like, we don't want, nothing against Vanderbilt, but we don't want to share everything with Vanderbilt. We hired you guys are smart. If you guys invent something, we want Pathfinder to be the sole owners of it. And so, so there were a couple tricky moments like that where we had to think very carefully about what we disclosed and how we engaged the founders that were at Vanderbilt, because then as part of our licensing agreement, then does Vanderbilt own part of it? What if we came up primarily with the invention and they added a little bit? Did they kind of do that as a Pathfinder founder or as a Vanderbilt faculty member? So it can get pretty sticky in that situation.
When you found Pathfinder, why, if you were subcontracting out with Vanderbilt, why did you go for the SBIR instead of the STTR?
It was pretty clear there was no reason to go for STTR. The technology that was to be transferred, it was pretty simple. We thought our chances were a lot better with SBIR. It wasn't very complex. The device was built, there was software available. We were just going to throw it over the wall to the business. So the idea of a lot of the work being done in the research institutions didn't make any sense. Most of the work at that point had to be done by the small business. When you
So
look
just
at
percent effort?
Yeah, it just didn't make any sense. We were ready to commercialize this thing, and we obviously told a good story because they liked it and funded it. And so it just made more sense there. Plus, at that point, I had decided, hey, I'm quitting my job, and it made sense for me to be the PI. So, and I was going to work primarily for the company.
The PI does need to have those technical qualifications, right? You can't just have anybody as PI.
Yes, well, we'll talk a little bit about that. I've seen grants, yes and no. I would say on an SBIR, you don't have to be as technically, you don't have to have a PhD like you do on like a typical NSF or one of those kind of grants. I've seen people with high school degrees. I've heard people with high school degrees win SBIRs. From Mark Henry, he told me he's this guy in Wyoming won a bunch of SBIRs. The guy had a high school degree, so they don't care as much. Obviously, when you got these being reviewed by a bunch of academics, they're going to look at the pedigree, PhD from Harvard or this or that. It's just the nature of the business. I would think that on any of these grants, you got to have someone who's a subject matter expert that has some of the street cred. It does not have to be the PI though.
Right.
It doesn't.
That's a very important point, actually.
Well, then it allows you to do this, right? If you have a graduate student or even an undergraduate student that can lead the research, they don't have to be the be all and end all. If you tell a good story around the advisor at Vanderbilt or whatever is going to advise the student, but the student has shown a lot of potential to be able to commercialize this, they have the wherewithal to do it, you can win. Or they may look at it and be like, this guy's will never, one reviewer may say this is never going to work. Here are some of the critical differences. You guys are asking great questions. We're a little bit behind on slides, but this is just a summary of the difference between SBIR and STTR. So just a snapshot, we've covered it, we've covered most everything. One thing we didn't cover was only the 5 largest agencies have STTR. So not even all the agencies have STTR. And those 5 are NIH, NSF, DOD, NASA, and DOE. Yeah, I think, are the 5. Yeah, we have just a few more, so yeah, we'll get through. I do want to get to the registration. So we're going to talk a little bit more about grants versus contracts. You guys, I don't need to tell this audience, you guys know that these, when you go and you find the PARs or the RFAs, all of them are different. They all have different budgets. They all have different scopes. They want you to add this or that or the other. If you're going to go after a specific solicitation, which I strongly recommend you do, if you find one that's specific to what you're doing, your chances of winning go way up. But you have to realize that there's a lot of details in there that you got to consider. Some of them are really positive. Some of them they'll offer up to $500,000 for a phase 1 because they know it's going to take longer to get through a phase 1 type of project and going to take more than $150,000 or $200,000. So those opportunities are good, but they're all different. We'll talk a little bit more about grants versus contracts. DOD is all contracts. Has anybody here written a DOD SBIR in the room? We probably won't cover that too. I don't think this audience is around that. But they're all contracts, whereas the NIH is about 98% grants. So we'll go through that. Review, we've talked about the review process. It's a bit of a crapshoot, and it's frustrating, but the system's the system. You can't change it. Here's the different agencies that participate. You can see their sizes. So you can see the biggest ones have, hundreds of millions of dollars. These smaller ones don't have very much at all. If you're going to go after an EPA grant, they only have $4.2 million a year. If your project is really around the environment, maybe you got a shot to win, but they're not giving out a lot of awards. They don't have big SBIR departments. So you guys, if you're in NIH, you know it's really the National Institutes of Health, and every single one of these has an SBIR program that's in the light pink. They all have different sizes. National Cancer Institute has a much bigger SBIR program than National Institute of Nursing Research. But they all should have an SBIR contact person, at least one SBIR contact person. Some of the agencies have these institutes have a lot more because they're just, once again, it's based on their budget. So if the NIH budget, if a lot of money is going towards cancer, then they have more SBIR money, therefore they have more people, more programs, more RFAs, more PARs. So there's more meat to their particular program. So when you think, oh, I'm going to apply to NIH, I'll just go to the NIH SBIR website. No, you need to find which agency you're interested in, and you need to go find the people at that agency. And this is somewhat the same for NSF. I tend to talk NIH language because that's my experience, but somewhat the same for like NSF. They have like 4 or 5 different programs. They're more broad, but there's a contact person that you can go to those as well. I'm going to skip over some of these. These just show the different sizes just to get it put in perspective. Okay, so contracts versus grants. Grants, believe it or not, only 40% of the entire SBIR, STTR program is grants. Most of it's contracts because of the heavy weight towards DOD. They're $1 billion of the $3.2 billion is DOD. How these grants are scored, reviewed, judged. If you're going after any contract, your job is to become best friends with the program manager who's going to be reviewing these contracts. They're not reviewed by outsiders. They're reviewed by personnel at that agency. So you get a good relationship with those people, and they believe in what you're doing, and they understand what you're doing. I'm not saying you can go up there and take them out for a nice dinner or anything. I mean, they won't let you do that, but you get a good relationship with them and they believe in what you're doing, they're the ones that are ultimately going to bat for you. Versus grants, they're bringing in outsiders who may have had a bad day, the day they reviewed your grant, woke up, stubbed their toe on the bed, you know, kids are being a pain and they're reading your grant, they may be in a bad mood and it's over. So, so you got to think carefully about the difference between those. And once again, most of I think what you guys are going to be going after is probably on the grant side of things. It just goes through that. Okay, so the registrations, and then we'll take a break. You have to create a small business. You have to go out and get an EIN or a tax identification number before you apply for these. You have to create an LLC. It's not expensive. I don't recommend going to LegalZoom and doing this. I recommend getting a lawyer, especially if you're going to be in licensing technologies. You want to, this is you got to put some skin in the game to get this done right. You can do an LLC, you can do a C Corp. We won't get into the details around the different kinds of corporations, but in either one of those scenarios, you can distribute stock or units of class units in an LLC to people, but you have to create a business. Then you got to go get a DUNS number. Takes one day, not hard. Then you got to do sam.gov, which is painful, very painful. But you have to do it as a small business. And then basically after those three, oh, and I guess everybody has to do the SBA thing. That takes like an hour. That doesn't take very long. But then after that, every agency is a little bit different. Unfortunately, here's your cheat sheet on that. I don't even know what an electronic handbook is. I've never done a NASA application, but there's one there they add. Most of you are probably familiar with ERA Commons. You're going to be living in that. You use Assist. It's the same process. Just understand that you are the person not only submitting the grant as the PI, but if you're also the you can also be the signing officer, which right now Vanderbilt has their own signing officers and things for different departments. You're everything. Like when you go to submit this grant, you're going into one account, going into the other account, approving this and that. It's not, you are responsible for everything as the small business. And it can be one person can have all these roles. There's nothing wrong with that. But you have to make sure you have all the roles correct. And then when you go to submit, if you've missed something and it's like the application's due that day, which is pretty difficult. I try and do it the day before just so I can sleep that night. But you know, you have to make sure you have all this done. If you miss something along the way, you're screwed. You can be totally screwed. So, and you don't have anybody at Vanderbilt to call. This is your grant. This is you're the small business. So there's a process to this. We have. Fortunately, the SBIR website has gotten a lot better at walking you through these. And when I do consulting for different clients, I probably spend at least 2 or 3 hours helping them get all this done and make sure it's done right. So, you know, this is it's just a necessary evil to the process, and it's kind of a weed out. It discourages a lot of people, I think, from doing it. So.